Coming up on episode 75 of Omnivore, how GLP-1 medications are rewriting food and beverage demand signals, and the next phase of ultra-processed food research, what the science really says about energy density, formulation, and overeating. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology Magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT membership. To the innovators, the connectors, the changemakers, the future leaders, IFT is your professional home, a global community shaping the future of food. Explore the benefits of membership at ift.org/join.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. Few forces are reshaping consumer behavior as quickly or as dramatically as GLP-1 medications. New analysis from Circana shows just how far-reaching the ripple effects may be. GLP-1 households already make up nearly a quarter of U.S. homes and are on pace to account for roughly 35% of all food and beverage unit sales by 2030. That surge is already influencing what people buy, how they shop, and which categories stand to grow or contract. The behavioral signals are striking and sometimes surprising. GLP-1 users are prioritizing protein, fiber, and healthy fat products. Their spending is shifting as well, trimming some retail food and beverage purchases while increasing restaurant spend. And even after discontinuing the medication, many of these new habits actually stick. To help make sense of this evolving landscape, Food Technology's Julie Larson-Brisher spoke with Sally Lyons Wyatt, Global Executive Vice President and Chief Advisor for Consumer Goods and Food Service Insights at Circana, about what these trends mean for retailers, product developers, and CPG manufacturers.
Hi, Sally. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today about consumer trends and GLP-1s. It's a hot topic that seems to be getting hotter.
Hi, Julie, and thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation. And you are right. GLP-1s are definitely fascinating and a fast evolving topic. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, let's dive right in then. Circana's research shows that GLP-1 households could drive 35% of all food and beverage unit sales by 2030. My gosh, what a number. And what do you think that shift means for CPG manufacturers in the next 2 to 3 years? And where should they be prioritizing innovation first?
All manufacturers really should establish and enhance their GLP-1 strategies. If they don't have one, they need to get it going. But if they do, then really trying to understand how they can assist consumers with their weight loss journeys before, during, and even after medication usage. And that will indeed take their organization to first look at current portfolio before I would go and even invest in innovative ideas. Because there may be ways you can take what you have and stretch it to, or even match it up with what consumers are looking for. Then you want to evaluate your innovation pipelines and make sure to include different attributes and benefits that maybe you don't have in your current portfolio, but yet that consumers need to have addressed. That's really aligned to what medical professionals are encouraging patients to eat and drink: more proteins, more fibers, less saturated fats, less high levels of sugar, less processed meat. Really looking at those things to engage current consumers, but also maybe those that you want to attract into your portfolio. And then lastly, if indeed you come across an ingredient that might not be out there today, but one that would be beneficial for those taking the GLP-1 medications, then education is a must.
What kind of ingredient would that be? Do you have an example?
There's more insight around microbiomes today than we've had in the past. Therefore, there could be some things that come out of that knowledge. And as we see every year in this industry, there's always a new take, even on ancient grain ingredients. There could be new ways of refreshing ingredients that we hadn't thought of. So who knows, really? But at the same time, I think it could be in those territories.
Yeah. Well, I also read in this new research from Circana where you identified a major pivot toward higher protein, higher fiber, and healthy fat products among GLP users. So which categories or product attributes do you believe are most at risk, and which represent the biggest growth opportunities?
Well, the ones that are most at risk are actually feeling it today. We've seen negative shifts in categories like wine, pre-mixed cocktails, shelf-stable dip mixes, which are higher in saturated fat, salad dressings, especially refrigerated salad dressings. Again, you see the high saturated fat. So there's categories like these that are among the list of products that medical professionals suggest you avoid while you're on the medication. Most of the reason why is it doesn't help, with the weight loss or managing the disease states. But in addition, you just don't feel as well as when you are leaning into the positive ingredients that medical professionals are encouraging you to eat more of. And we see that with the categories that have seen positive shifts, like when you think about some of the refrigerated deli meats that are out there, you can get them in portion controlled options so that you are able to align to your feeling of not quite as hungry as you might be if you weren't taking the medication. We see an uptick in even gum, which is around moistening your mouth because you get dry mouth and or halitosis while on the medication. We see upticks in fresh citrus fruit because we see a big uptick in produce while consumers are taking it. Because again, there isn't many diets that don't recommend that, but we see that uptick as well. Those are just some examples, but it just gives you an idea of anything that's in that area of positive assistance for the consumer on their journey. I think we will continue to see upticks in those categories.
So I read a lot about how GLP-1 users are really they're kind of pushed towards shopping the perimeter of the store. But did you guys' research find anything to do with what kind of growth opportunities might be in the middle of the store? That more shelf-stable type product or frozen foods even?
Sure. So hydration is a big need while you're taking the medication. So shelf-stable, non-fruit drinks, sports drinks that are in the center of the store, snack bars in the middle of the store, dried meat snacks, also from a protein convenience standpoint. So yes, absolutely, there are opportunities in the center of the store. And again, part of this could be an education play for those manufacturers to remind consumers about the benefits of their products, either the convenience and the ingredients or the protein or the fiber that they can deliver. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, for any category in the store.
Well, were there any findings that surprised you?
We actually found a correlation in new moms. So that was my big one. Our research is time aligned, meaning no matter if you started the medication in January, June, October, it really didn't matter. It was all about us looking at month 1, month 2, month 3, all the way through past year 1, just so we could understand what are those shifts you make when you're on the medication. And by the end of year 1, we found a negative shift in categories like baby formula, baby food, baby gifts and toys, baby needs, baby diapers. And so what that suggests is that the babies are not infants anymore, but they're now becoming more toddlers. And that really pointed us to new moms trying to lose their baby fat. So I thought that one was one of those that we found that we didn't expect to see. And another insight that we found on the other side of the spectrum is baking. Many baking categories realize negative shifts after taking the medication for 1 year. And I think also during that year, we've seen the shifts. Categories like baking mixes, sugar, bakeware, all realized declines. And I just feel like when you are, typical of really any diet, right? You're not going to eat those sweets. You're not going to want to put the time in to make those. You might want to do it for your family, but sometimes you want to do it so you can enjoy, right? So you still might bake, but maybe not as much.
That's interesting, especially after 2020, 2021, where baking was like the hobby everyone did during the pandemic.
And honestly, baking is still actually hot in that regard with different consumers. It's just for those on GLP-1 medication, maybe not as much as if you're off the medication. And I think that's the message. Baking right now, when we look at it, we are seeing some upticks, especially like the low-income consumers that are staying at home more. They're finding joy and escapism and excitement from doing baking. But your lifestyle is a bit different when you are managing, preventing a disease state or trying to lose weight.
So true. Well, now I also read in the report that even after discontinuing GLP-1 meds, many consumers kind of hold on to new habits. What behaviors appear sticky, and how should brands adapt their long-term assortment or marketing strategies even in response?
We see sustained growth in categories like produce, household plastics, and storage and personal care. And that all makes sense because you're going to eat more produce. It's all good. And you love it, right? Produce is so yummy because you've got kind of the savory and the sweet. And so you want to keep that going because you enjoy it. Household storage is more for leftovers because, again, maybe you're not eating as much and you can save some of what you cook for the next day. And then personal care, it's really all about taking care of the new you, right? It's people want to continue to feel better, look their best. And so personal care helps with that. We also saw rebounds with beverages, refrigerated and frozen departments, as well as disposable housewares and tobacco. I think for manufacturers that are in those segments that might feel a little bit of the negative shift during the GLP-1 usage, then it's again back to what we talked about at the very beginning. Assess your current portfolio. Can you talk to consumers and remind them that you are an answer, whether it's for, especially in frozen, it could be less waste, it could be portion control, it could be variety, it could be price. There's a lot of things that they can really remind consumers of. And the same with some of the other categories. I think it's just, again, reminding consumers, educating them. And then if you don't have something that can embrace these consumers, then go to your innovation pipeline.
Right. And finally, I'm going to ask you one more question today. It is really for CPG and retail leaders who are trying to get ahead of these changes we've been talking about. What are the most important steps they should take now? Whether, it's product reformulation, pack size changes, new category management strategies. What would you say are the most important steps?
Well, I'm going to repeat myself, and I'm so sorry for the listeners, but the first step is to really look at your strategy, either develop one or refine it. Now, as part of that, you want to look at your current portfolio. Again, a little bit of a repeat, but here's where I would say I haven't talked a lot about, and that is perhaps you can use personalized messages that can be for a targeted campaign. Basically, leverage what you have by educating and informing consumers to drive demand. Today, you can actually take this to new depths by driving deeper GLP-1 insights and understanding of the consumer behavior combined with technology-enabled nutrition guidance, right? So what are some of those products that are going to absolutely be great alignment to these cohorts? And that will help you identify who they are, drive your promotions, also leveraging kind of, again, more personalized comments, educate and engage in the consumer via tailored food guidance, linking health goals, prescription status, and grocery options into actionable pathways. You can leverage analytics for competitive advantage across a more refined assortment. And then when you think about that last billboard, it's your package. So consider packaging and messaging to showcase superior ingredients, healthier recipes, really aligning to the weight loss goals. And then lastly, as you think about the day, there are different ways to help the consumer, whether it's the morning, getting the day going, and some of the morning options, the mid-morning, midday, because these consumers might not be eating larger meals. They're eating smaller portions, and they are doing that across the day. So can you find products that you can highlight differently depending on the time of day, and leveraging some of the retailers that can really activate against that, as well as think about delivery services and being able to get some reminders when maybe somebody's ordering off one of the platforms and helping them find the path to assist them with that particular daily need. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, it was. And thanks so much again, Sally, for sharing your insights with our Omnivore listeners today. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, Julie, thank you so much. And I've really appreciated being able to be part of this. So thank you.
Sally Lyons Wyatt is the Global Executive Vice President and Chief Advisor for Consumer Goods and Food Service Insights at Circana. Learn more about how food and beverage companies are adjusting to the fast-moving GLP-1 marketplace in the January-February issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
To the curious, to the bold, to the ones shaping the future of food, IFT is where you belong. As a member, you'll enjoy a global community united by purpose, driven by science, and ready to make a lasting impact on our food system. Connect with peers, thought leaders, and trusted experts. Stay on top of cutting-edge research and take your innovations and career further. You belong here. Become a member today at ift.org/join.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Ultra-processed foods are once again at the center of public debate, driven by new published research, growing policy interest, and ongoing questions about what these products actually do in the body. Few scientists have shaped that conversation more than Kevin Hall, whose control feeding studies at the National Institutes of Health in 2019 explored how formulation, energy density, texture, and nutrient combinations influence calorie intake. Hall's work suggests that the mechanisms behind overeating are far more nuanced than the broad brush label ultra-processed suggests. His latest research points to the potential role of non-beverage energy density, water loss during processing, and hyperpalatable nutrient pairings. His new book, Food Intelligence, aims to cut through the noise and hyperbole by helping lay readers understand the science behind appetite, metabolism, and the food environment. I recently spoke with Kevin about what the current research actually tells us, why he believes the ongoing debate over definitions might be slowing scientific progress, and where interdisciplinary collaboration among nutritionists, food scientists, and industry researchers could accelerate solutions. Well, Kevin, welcome to the podcast and congratulations on your book.
Thanks very much.
It's generating a lot of thoughtful discussion, especially as ultra-processed foods continue to make headlines following the recent study that was published in The Lancet. So I'd like to revisit and expand on some of the themes from our recent food technology interview, starting with where the science currently stands on UPF. So your latest studies suggest that ultra-processed foods don't inherently drive overeating per se, but rather there are some specific design features in there. As you've continued to unpack energy density, texture, eating rate, and hyper-palatable nutrient combinations, what are some of the insights of your recent work that you think are most important for food scientists to understand right now?
Yeah, and it's a good point. And I think that when it comes to this question about, are ultra processed foods associated with things like obesity, which is my particular interest? I mean, I think that the answer to that question seems to be yes. And, what I've been particularly interested in our research is to try to figure out, number one, is that a causal relationship? And if so, what are the mechanisms by which diets that might be high in ultra processed foods might be driving excess calorie intake in particular, which then subsequently leads to weight gain and eventually obesity. And so, in our first study, we basically just designed two different kind of food environments, one that was minimally processed, the other that was 80% of calories from ultra processed foods, according to the NOVA classification system, and matched the presented calories and many of the nutrients, the carbohydrates, the fat, the sodium, the sugar, the fiber, as well as like overall energy density, glycemic load. Many things were matched, but of course, a whole bunch of things were unmatched, right? Because if you're using real foods and you're trying to kind of design these sorts of different food environments, there's many things that go unmatched when you do these sorts of experiments. And what we found in our original study back in 2019 was that people did, in fact, overconsume calories when they were exposed to this ultra processed food environment. And the same people, when they were exposed to the minimally processed food environment, lost weight and they ate many fewer calories. And then the question was, obviously, the answer's got to be in something that was unmatched, right, between these two food environments. And one of the things I think is a little bit frustrating about the terminology of ultra processed food is that it's focusing on some aspect of processing, right? Whereas practically speaking, when you're trying to identify foods that belong to this very broad ultra processed category, what you end up doing is focusing on ingredients, right? And looking at essentially the formulation of the foods, because those are the things that are listed on the label, not the mechanisms by which people have processed it. I mean, you could make an educated guess whether or not a product was, manufactured using, extrusion or something, high pressure extrusion, but it's not listed, and the manufacturers aren't required to list that. So practically speaking, it's more about formulation, although processing and steps of processing may also play a role in what the final product looks like in terms of its, for example, energy density. And so the trick then was, okay, well, now you've got this signal of there's some sort of causal relationship between a diet that was high in ultra processed food and excess calorie consumption and weight gain. What is it that is driving that effect? And that's where we start to look at the things that were unmatched between the two diet groups. And one of the things that was unmatched was the sort of non-beverage energy density. Once you took away the beverages from the meals that we presented to people, it turned out that despite being matched for the nutrients, like the macronutrients, we were presenting people with more energy dense meals in the ultra processed diet condition, primarily because a lot of the water had been extracted, right? That's one of the things that happens in the processing process, is that you're trying to increase shelf life and reduce the moisture content. That typically involves disrupting the food matrix and removing that water from the foods. And so you end up concentrating the calories into a more energy dense calories per bite in some sense. And so one of the questions that we had was, well, what if we were able to design still an 80% of calories from ultra processed diet, but it had a lower non-beverage energy density similar to the minimally processed diet? Another thing that we found that was not matched between the original two diets was the number of individual foods that were so-called hyperpalatable by Tara Fazzino's definition, which involves pairs of nutrients crossing pre-specified thresholds. So an individual food that's both high in fat and sugar, high in fat and salt, or high in carbs and salt. And it turned out that we were presenting people with more of these individual foods on the plate that were these hyperpalatable combinations in the ultra-processed diet condition compared to minimally processed, despite the fact that the whole plate itself had the same numbers of percentage of nutrients coming from these different factors. And so then the question was, does that actually play a role in this? And so we did some retrospective analysis, and it turned out that retrospectively you could explain quite a bit of the difference between in these two factors, as well as the speed of eating, that people were eating the ultra processed meals more quickly in terms of grams per minute in the first study. And I know that Karen Ford's group in Holland has done a nice study looking at the texture of foods and trying to reformulate the texture to change the eating rate. And there was a paper published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition very recently showing that, yeah, if you change the texture of ultra processed meals, then you can manipulate the speed of eating and also the calorie intake that people consume. So that can also potentially play an important role. So based on that retrospective analysis, we designed a new study that would reformulate the ultra processed food environment such that we had one condition where we kept the same high energy density, but lowered the number of individual foods that met these hyperpalatable combinations. And then we reformulated another ultra processed diet that had both the energy density and the hyperpalatable foods lowered to match the minimally processed condition. So we had these 4 different test diets now, 3 that were 80% of calories from ultra processed foods, varying in energy density and hyperpalatable foods, and 1 minimally processed diet. And the results of that study, we just finished it. Actually, it's not yet published. You'll see a paper hopefully in the new year soon. But the upshot is that the diet that had that was still very ultra processed, and according to the NOVA classification system, but had lower energy density and lower amounts of hyperpalatable foods, led to very similar amounts of calorie intake as a minimally processed diet, and did not lead to weight gain. Whereas the other 2 ultra processed diets that had higher energy density and either was still high in hyperpalatable foods or low in hyperpalatable foods, those both led to overconsumption of calories and weight gain. And interestingly, eating rate in this study was not different between any of the diet conditions. So while it may play an important role in some contexts, we saw big swings in calorie intake in this study without differences in eating rate. So for example, the minimally processed diet compared to the highly ultra processed diet with high energy density and high hyperpalatable foods was now 950 calories per day different. So huge differences in calorie intake, seemingly mitigated by addressing both the non-beverage energy density and the proportion of foods on the plate that were these hyperpalatable combinations.
Anytime we're talking about UPFs, so much of the scientific discussion and the debate continues to circle around this question of definitions. What counts as a UPF? Is NOVA the right mechanism to capture the right distinctions, or should it be some other framework? Why do you think that the discussion is so anchored to these classification debates? And do you feel that there are any unintended consequences of that?
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting and frustrating to see this discussion continuing, because I think that we have to separate out what's actually in the NOVA classification system from maybe the original intent of the NOVA classification system. And as scientists, we should be able to do that, right? I mean, just because we might not agree with everything that's being proposed in terms of the intent of the introduction does not mean that we can't take the NOVA classification system on its own. So one, I think, confusion that there is number one, that it's just about processing, right? It's, again, I think we touched on this in the previous question. It's a bit of a misnomer, right? It's, and the way you practically identify these foods is by looking at the ingredients list for the most part. And the other aspect is that it's a scary sounding word to many people, and it seems to presume, just on the basis of definition, that an ultra processed food is unhealthy. It's not in the definition, right? That's an empirical question. And what I've been trying to introduce is the idea that there probably are many healthy ultra processed foods, and that the definition and the scary sounding word do not mean that there can't be healthy ultra processed foods. It just means that we need to do the work to figure out what those subcategories of foods are. And to do that, you have to work on mechanisms and try to identify those subcategories of ultra processed foods. So, and the other thing that I think everybody agrees on is that the NOVA classification system was designed not for regulatory purposes or for even policy purposes. It was defined for research purposes, right? And in that sense, it's been hugely successful, right? I mean, there's been a huge number of research papers that have come out using this NOVA classification system by any sort of standard metric of measuring productivity in science. I mean, it's been pretty explosive in that regard. And so I see a lot of knee-jerk reactions to saying, oh, it's unscientific. And well, I mean, science is about proposing something and then testing to see if it has utility and testing to see if there's something underlying it that is a better explanation. So I don't see it as unscientific at all. I see it as a reasonable first step to kind of understand things about foods that maybe we hadn't understood before. Maybe we had understood them before, but they're playing a somewhat different role than we'd seen in the past. And I think that that's an important move forward.
I could pivot for a second to talk a little bit about food intelligence. You said in our previous discussion, one of your goals in writing this book was to demystify the science of nutrition for the public that is feeling overwhelmed by all this conflicting advice. So when you step back from your research and look at the broader food environment, what do you most want people to understand differently about after reading Food Intelligence, and where do you hope it elevates the public conversation?
I think that the thing that I would really like the public to understand, in addition to kind of the fascinating science of nutrition and metabolism research, which is a big part of it, but the thing that I think has been interesting, especially in the field of obesity, which is kind of where I've kind of come from in my recent career, has been this notion that healthy eating patterns are solely your personal responsibility, and that the environment that you find yourself in, doesn't really have much impact on that. And I think what we want to do is flip that script entirely and show people the underlying biology of appetite control and body weight regulation is such that it is highly dependent on the environment that you find yourself in. That there's a genetic component, that some people are much more genetically susceptible to shifting food environments than other people. And you do have some degree of control over what your choices are at any given moment. But the biological control of appetite and food intake is operating on very long timescales, and it's being heavily influenced by our food environment. And so if we want to tackle diet-related chronic diseases, that especially those that are downstream of obesity, of which there are many, we need to tackle that food environment. And I think that has been part of the success of the grassroots Make America Healthy Again movement, the idea that now there's bipartisan support for making our food environments healthier for people, and whether that happens from the bottom up by consumer demand or from the top down by policies and regulations. I think that there's a real hunger for that change in the food environment to make the healthy alternatives the default, the healthy alternatives to be the most convenient, readily available, inexpensive products. And that's not the situation that we find ourselves in, right? Right now, we find ourselves in the most profitable and heavily marketed products are also the ones that are the least healthy for us.
You said, some of your research indicates that modifying some specific attributes of some of these processed foods without necessarily eliminating them can make have meaningful impact. So elaborate on this a little bit. Where do you see as being some of the most realistic and impactful opportunities for reformulation or product redesign that you've seen that might present some opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much of the discussion has been around the idea of targeting certain harmful products, taxing them, putting warning labels on them. And I think that, yeah, that has to happen. But I think where the real opportunity lies is in developing products that are probably going to be more expensive for manufacturers to make, and therefore we have to come up with ways to support those products. How do we kind of target large sectors of the food economy that would actually have a meaningful impact? The example that we use in our book is pizza in America, right? So pizza is consumed so frequently and so often in America that if you were to reformulate pizza in a way that you used whole grain crusts, that you used, cheese that didn't have as high amounts of saturated fat, that you used fresh veggies, or even like alternative crusts that were manufactured that didn't have as much refined grains in them. Um, you could and reduce the sugar content of the tomato sauce, all sorts of things that you could do, and in fact has been done. Mike Lean and Donnie McLean in the UK have come up with a reformulated pizza that meet the UK Eat Well guidelines. Right? It turns out I think it's a little more expensive, but it's delicious, and in the US, pizza is consumed enough that according to one modeling study, reformulation of pizza alone could have public health consequences. And to what extent can government play a role in subsidizing these more healthful alternatives and kind of incentivizing those things and de-incentivizing the others, right? Because I think the danger that we find ourselves right now in many of the policies that are being put forward is that there's no subsidization, there's no incentive to kind of create the better products.
One of the striking things when we were having our conversation for the food technology interview is that you said that you were surprised to discover how little cross-pollination typically occurs between traditional food scientists and nutritionists, for example. And, this kind of collaboration is going to be really essential to solving some of these problems. So if you could spark one interdisciplinary collaboration that you think would really accelerate some meaningful research and innovation, what would be on your wish list?
Yeah, no. So what I would really love to do is something that I actually proposed while I was still in federal government, and we talked a little bit about it in our book, Food Intelligence. I proposed a collaboration with folks in industry to work with nutrition scientists to kind of essentially almost redo the kinds of studies that we did in our NIH trials, where we did not do, for very practical reasons, the food by food comparison. Right? How do we take a ultra processed lasagna that's high in energy density and hyperpalatable nutrient combinations and was eaten very quickly because of its texture, et cetera, et cetera. And how do we re-engineer that food on a food by food basis so that it still might be ultra processed, but actually doesn't result in the deleterious health consequences when it comes to overconsumption of calories? That's going to require food technologists and scientists to work on that sort of food by food basis to try to come up with re-engineered foods that don't have the same sorts of consequences as the original sorts of products. And so I would love to be able to kind of work with food scientists and technologists and design studies to actually demonstrate that these re-engineered products don't have some of the deleterious consequences of the original product. So right now, the way we've been reformulating our meals is not on a food by food basis, because we don't have food scientists and technologists to kind of re-engineer foods. What we've been doing is just choosing amongst the foods that are currently available that don't reach certain thresholds. But the meals look very different in these two different diet conditions, and that's been a subject of criticism, right? It's like, okay, it's a valid criticism, so let's actually do this. But to do that, we need people who have experience running human nutrition clinical trials with, the dietitians who kind of design the overall menus, with food scientists and technologists to re-engineer foods along certain pathways, be it, textural pathways or energy density or formulations, and actually measure the results in human beings. And so that's the kind of project that I think would make a lot of headway. And at the end of the day, you'd have answers to the questions. Were we able to successfully re-engineer that frozen lasagna that's in your supermarket to be something that doesn't cause people to overeat? And you'd have those sorts of prototype products ready to kind of be optimized for sale and whatnot in the future. And I think that kind of research, as far as I know, does not happen, right? Food scientists and technologists do like focus groups and like they'll have tasting tests, but it's a single meal, right? And it's not like as part of a controlled feeding study where you actually measure physiological outcomes, which is, I think, what's needed to kind of make these transitions and be able to make the kinds of products that are going to improve the health of folks.
So, as somebody who comes at this as a career researcher in the public sector, I have to ask you about your thoughts on the current state of research funding, because the traditional funding model for basic research has been disintegrating for some time now and arguably has accelerated a lot in recent years. So, when you look at where the gaps are, what do you think is what is a credible, transparent, scientifically protected funding model look like in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that had been one of the nice things about being at the NIH, was that we had that sort of protected status. We didn't rely on industry funding to kind of do our studies, and as a result had a little bit maybe more credibility than maybe we deserved because of that sort of walling off of the potential conflicts of interest that occur. I think that oftentimes nutrition scientists, because nutrition science from that federal level has always been an underfunded area, pretty woefully underfunded in my opinion, that they've had to rely on industry funding and direct industry funding, and have been unfairly characterized as being biased or conflicted as a result of that. But, the evidence is that, when you do have a funder who is doing these things, the choice of the research study, the choice of the kinds of questions that you're asking, are influenced by the funder, right? I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. And so I guess the question is there some sort of happy medium between entirely industry funded, entirely government funded, especially given the potential constraints on government funding in the future? I think there is a model for this. There's something called the Health Effects Institute that was formed, I believe it was in the early 1980s. It's a collaboration between the automobile industry, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as a bunch of philanthropic groups that all basically said, look, we've been arguing about the health effects of automobile pollution for a long time. The automobile industry says, there's nothing really to see here. The environmental folks have said, no, this is causing increased rates of asthma and other sort of health conditions. We need an independent group to be able to receive funds from unrestricted funds from the automobile industry, from the EPA and philanthropy groups to design and the best studies to get to the bottom of some of these questions. And that institute still exists. The Health Effects Institute has been a model of this sort of interdisciplinary and intersector collaboration for decades now, and has really improved the quality of the air that we breathe. I think we need a Health Effects Institute for nutrition science. And if we had that ability to kind of bring together in an unrestricted way, where the funders did not have a say in the kinds of studies that were being run, but where obviously the results would be of interest in a non-competitive basis. What the research was finding was going to be important for both regulators as well as the industries that are being affected. I think that's the path forward, especially now that we have a certain amount of distrust in government. Government can't do this alone, I don't think. I think we need independent, trusted sources that can be the sort of mediators of this kind of research moving forward. I hope that such a thing will happen, but and I know I've been talking with some folks about the possibilities for that, but I think we need a lot of support from members of Congress. We need support from members of the food industry, need support from members of the nutrition science community to kind of bring everybody together to create such an entity. But I think that's really the only path forward, to kind of have the trust in the science that comes out of that, being very scientifically focused and getting the answers that we all need.
Kevin Hall is a leading researcher in nutrition and metabolism and the co-author of Food Intelligence, the science of how food both nourishes and harms us. Read more of his thoughts on the state of ultra-processed foods research in the January-February issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, IFT Membership. To the scientists, students, collaborators, innovators, and leaders shaping the future of food, You belong here. IFT is your community for trusted knowledge, lifelong learning, and meaningful experiences and connections. Join us today at ift.org/join.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.